On the evening of April 10th, 2026, 4 people are plummeting through the Earth's atmosphere. Their speed, nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour. Inside the capsule, everything is vibrating. It starts as a subtle tremor, like the rhythmic rattle of a train. But it quickly escalates into a violent shudder, a shaking so intense the instrument panels begin to blur. That low moan from outside swells into a deafening roar. It feels like being strapped inside the heart of a jet engine. And then, through the portholes, the darkness starts to glow. At first, it's just a faint orange halo, but it sharpens, growing brighter and brighter, until the world outside is nothing but a blinding white fire. They're hurtling through the atmosphere, encased in a ball of superheated plasma. The only thing standing between the crew and a searing 2,700 degrees is a single heat shield. And here is the most chilling part of the story. NASA knew that shield was flawed. They knew it before the rocket even left the pad. During a previous unmanned test flight, this exact shield had failed. The material cracked and splintered in over 100 different places. This wasn't just an accident they had to survive, it was a risk they knowingly chose to take. Inside this capsule, ironically named Integrity, sat 4 people. Americans Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, alongside Canadian Jeremy Hansen. NASA sent them into the void, fully aware that their only ticket home had already failed once before. But here's the most striking part. Engineers from the Apollo program faced this exact same problem 50 years ago, and they solved it. So how was that knowledge lost? This isn't just a story about an accident. It's a story about a choice that put everything on the line. How did NASA reach this point? How did 4 people end up in a craft with a known flawed heat shield? And why was that risk considered acceptable? The story begins 4 years earlier with a mission that looked like a total success, right up until they pulled the capsule out of the water. In December 2022, NASA launched the uncrewed Artemis I mission. It was a dress rehearsal, the ultimate test flight designed to send the Orion spacecraft around the moon and back. To the outside observer, the entire operation looked flawless. The spacecraft nailed every maneuver, captured breathtaking photos of the lunar surface, and ended with a gentle splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. By all accounts, the mission was a total success. But as the capsule emerged from the water, the engineers saw something they never expected. The 16-foot heat shield, a massive disc made from a specialized material called Avcoat, was severely damaged. It was designed to char evenly, layer by layer, eroding away to bleed off the intense heat of reentry. Instead, the outer shell had fractured, causing entire chunks of the material to break off. The Inspector General for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration later reported that these fragments were large enough to create a literal trail of debris behind the spacecraft. Engineers counted damage in more than 100 different locations. In the end, they concluded that a human crew likely would have survived. But that was cold comfort. The ship's primary line of defense had failed to perform as designed. It kicked off a massive investigation, one that would span nearly 2 years. Across the country, hundreds of engineers at research centers scrambled to figure out exactly what went wrong. They ran more than 100 different tests, shipping nearly 200 samples of the Avcoat material from the Artemis I heat shield to various labs. They blasted it in plasma ovens, they stretched it, crushed it, and scanned it with lasers. They even funneled it through hypersonic wind tunnels, doing whatever it took to force the material to give up its secrets. In December 2024, they finally found it. The root cause was a material called Avcoat, and it simply wasn't porous enough. Here's how it works. As the spacecraft slams into the atmosphere, the intense heat triggers a chemical reaction deep inside the shield known as pyrolysis. This process releases gas. Essentially, the shield is boiling from the inside out, and that gas is supposed to escape through microscopic pores in the material. But on Artemis I, the charred outer layer became too dense. It became airtight, trapping those gases inside. Pressure built and built until it reached a breaking point. Then, like a sequence of tiny explosions, pockets of gas detonated, bursting outward and ripping away chunks of the protective layer. It's a lot like blisters popping on your skin after a severe sunburn. At first glance, this looks like a complex engineering riddle for the 21st century, one finally cracked by the most advanced technology we have. But here's the tragic irony. Engineers on the Apollo program already had the answer 50 years ago. They encountered the exact same phenomenon and specifically designed the original Avcoat material to be porous, allowing gases to escape freely. For the Artemis missions, NASA slightly tweaked the chemical formula, and that minor change accidentally sealed the very pores the Apollo engineers had worked so hard to create. A problem solved 50 years ago had come back to haunt them, all because of a simple case of institutional amnesia. The problem was identified, the cause was understood, a solution for future missions was mapped out. So, for Artemis II, the first crewed flight, you'd think they would just install a new, safe heat shield, right? Well, the truth turned out to be much more complicated and far more dangerous. When engineers found cracks in the Artemis I heat shield, the solution seemed obvious. Just install a new, improved version. But NASA was trapped. By the time the team fully understood the material's porosity issues, the heat shield for Artemis II wasn't just finished, it was already permanently fused to the capsule. Replacing it would mean dismantling half the spacecraft. For a program already 5 years behind schedule, that meant years of further delays. The pressure was massive. But here's the kicker. The shield for Artemis II was actually designed to be denser and less permeable than the one from the first mission. Engineers had tweaked the composition to test the strength of the bonding agent. Without knowing it, they had made the defect even worse. Eventually, NASA acknowledged the flaw and ordered a total redesign for all future flights, starting with Artemis III. But what about Artemis II? The agency reached a decision that is frankly chilling. They're going to fly with what they've got. How are they going to justify this? NASA had a theory. They suspected the fault lay not just in the shield's design, but in the specific way Artemis I entered the atmosphere. During that mission, the spacecraft performed what is known as a skip reentry. It essentially bounced off the upper layers of the atmosphere, like a flat stone skipping across water, before finally diving in for its descent. In those brief moments outside the dense air, the shield had just enough time to cool down. That was the problem. The charred outer layer hardened prematurely, sealing the internal gases inside. The resulting pressure caused the surface to flake off in explosive chunks. Their solution for Artemis II? Use a steeper, more direct trajectory, no more skipping. The goal was to keep the heat shield under constant, relentless heat, without giving it a single second to cool down. According to their calculations, this would keep the outer layer soft enough for the gases to vent out safely without shattering the material. It was an elegant engineering workaround, but it didn't actually solve the root cause. It was merely an attempt to bypass it. That's when a man stepped forward who refused to stay silent. Charles Camarda, a former astronaut and one of NASA's leading experts on thermal shields. He publicly challenged the agency's decision, and he brought the data to back it up. By his estimates, the probability of a catastrophic shield failure on Artemis II was 1 in 20. 1 chance in 20 that the crew wouldn't make it back. You could frame it differently. A 95% chance of success. Sounds pretty good, right? Not in the world of spaceflight. To understand the scale of that risk, look at NASA's own official safety standards. The maximum allowable risk of losing a crew during reentry is roughly 1 in 500. Camarda was describing a risk 25 times higher than the agency's own safety limit. This was no longer just a technical debate. It was a fundamental breakdown in the very definition of safety. But Camarda wasn't just talking about numbers. He was pointing to the very core of the decision-making culture, the institutional pressure that forced people to ignore uncomfortable data. He drew a direct line between this situation and the 2 greatest tragedies in NASA's history, the losses of the space shuttles Challenger and Columbia. On February 1, 2003, the space shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. All 7 crew members were lost. The cause was damage to the wing's thermal protection system, sustained 16 days earlier, right at the moment of launch. A chunk of insulating foam had broken off from the external fuel tank and struck the wing. The most chilling part? Engineers knew it was happening. They had warned management time and again that foam shed during nearly every launch. But management downplayed the risk every single time, categorizing it as acceptable. Until one day, it wasn't. To Camarda, history was repeating itself. A known flaw, the pressure of a deadline, and the decision to fly anyway, hoping for the best. Despite the warnings, an independent safety panel ultimately backed NASA's conclusions. Mission Commander Reid Wiseman even went public, stating he had full confidence in the modified plan. With the eyes of the entire world watching and the specters of past tragedies looming over them, the team made their choice. They were going. But before they could face the fire, they had to reach the moon. And it was there, in the dead silence of the cosmos, that the mission finally revealed its true nature. The crew of Artemis II made a high-stakes gamble, choosing to fly despite knowing their heat shield was compromised. Their historic journey began on April 1st, 2026. As the rocket cleared the pad and the engines fired for a brief 6-minute burn, they locked their course for the moon. It was the first crewed mission to our lunar neighbor since Apollo 17 in December 1972. 53 years. An entire generation had been born and raised without ever witnessing a human being leave low Earth orbit. For these 4 astronauts, this wasn't just a flight, it was humanity's return. On April 6th, as they rounded the far side of the moon, they drifted further from home than any human in history. The spacecraft reached a distance of 406,778 kilometers from Earth. It was a new milestone, shattering the record set by the Apollo 13 mission by more than 6,000 kilometers. But the numbers couldn't capture the weight of what they felt. They were a tiny spark of life, suspended in a vast and freezing void. Out there in that absolute silence, they witnessed something no human had ever seen. The moon, a perfect ink-black silhouette, slowly drifted in front of the sun. A ghostly corona flared around its edges like a shimmering, unearthly white flame. A solar eclipse witnessed from the far side of the moon. Astronaut Victor Glover would later recall it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. For a few minutes, the cabin fell silent. 4 people simply drifted in zero gravity, huddled together, staring out the window into the deep. But there was another moment, one that was quiet and deeply personal. During their orbit, the crew gave an official name to one of the moon's many anonymous craters. They named it after Carol, the late wife of mission commander Reid Wiseman. It was a gesture that carries no weight in an official logbook, but means everything to one man. A mark of love etched onto the surface of another world. They had shattered records. They had seen sights no human eye had ever witnessed. They had honored the past, but none of it would matter if they couldn't make it back home. On April 10th, it was time to face the fire. 13 minutes. That was all the time they had. After a 10-day journey to the moon and back, the Artemis II crew was hurtling toward Earth in a craft with a heat shield they knew was failing. Their lives now depended entirely on a modified reentry plan. There would be no second chances. On the evening of April 10th at 7:33 p.m., the capsule detached from the service module. It was now completely on its own. The final act had begun. At 7:53, Orion touched the upper atmosphere. It was screaming along at 24,661 miles per hour, roughly 35 times the speed of sound. The air in front of the capsule compresses so violently that it ignites into plasma. This fiery cocoon reaches temperatures of nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside is a blinding white hell. Inside, 4 people are pinned to their seats by nearly 4 Gs of force, enough to make every breath a struggle and any movement impossible. Peak heating on the shield hit exactly 1 minute and 22 seconds after atmospheric entry. This was the moment of truth. The heat shield would either hold firm or it would disintegrate. At this stage, there is no emergency escape system. There is no way to abort. If something goes wrong, no one is coming to help. They have to see this journey through to the very end. At the most dangerous moment, they were completely on their own. A shroud of superheated plasma engulfed the capsule, severing every radio link to the outside world. Inside mission control, everything went silent. This was the scheduled blackout, a 6-minute window where communication was physically impossible. 6 minutes where no one on Earth knew if the astronauts were even alive. Across the massive hall, a room full of the world's most brilliant engineers stared at screens that showed nothing. The telemetry was gone. Heart rates, cabin pressure, system vitals, it all vanished. The only sound coming through the speakers was the faint, hollow hiss of static. For 4 of those 6 minutes, the crew would be plummeting through the zone of maximum heat. 4 minutes of blistering fire on the outside, and total, helpless silence on the ground. The minutes felt like hours. 5 minutes passed, 5.5, 6. Suddenly, cutting through the crackle of static, a voice broke the silence. Calm, steady, almost routine. It was Commander Reid Wiseman. Just before 8 o'clock in the evening, he made contact, confirming the crew had survived the descent. A wave of relief washed over the room, a sensation so thick you could almost feel it. People who hadn't taken a breath for minutes finally exhaled. The modified reentry trajectory had performed exactly as the engineers intended. The Avcoat heat shield held firm, charring evenly, layer by layer, without cracking or falling to pieces. Now, all that remained was to slow down. At 22,000 feet, 2 drogue parachutes deployed. A minute later, at 6,000 feet, the 3 mains fired, each one the size of a football field. They blossomed with air, transforming what had been a fiery meteor into a slowly descending craft. At 8:07 p.m., the Orion capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, just off the coast of San Diego. The entire sequence, from atmospheric entry to hitting the water, had taken 13 minutes. Recovery teams from the USS John Murtha immediately closed in on the capsule. Before long, the flight surgeon confirmed the news. All 4 astronauts were safe and sound. They were safe. The gamble had paid off. But one question remained. Who were these 4 people? The ones who willingly climbed into a capsule knowing they faced a 1 in 20 chance of failure? And what kind of weight were they carrying with them on that long journey home? Reid Wiseman didn't just step into that capsule because he was the mission commander. For him, this was about a promise. Wiseman is a widower, raising his 2 daughters, Katie and Ellie, on his own. His wife, Carol, passed away from cancer in May 2020. She was only 46 years old. Even during her hardest moments, Carol urged him to stay with the space program, to never give up on his dream. She knew exactly what it meant to him, and as the Artemis II crew drifted over the silent gray expanse of the lunar surface, they picked out one small, unremarkable crater. They gave it a name heard only by the crew and those listening back at Mission Control. They called it Carol. Wiseman wasn't the only one carrying the weight of history. Every person on this crew was a pioneer. Mission pilot Victor Glover became the first black astronaut to leave Earth's orbit. Christina Koch already held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman. And Jeremy Hansen made history as the first Canadian to ever travel this far from home. This wasn't just a crew, it was a team of individuals rewriting the history books simply by stepping on board. But this level of risk won't need to be repeated. The calculated gamble NASA took with Artemis II will never be necessary again. For the following mission, Artemis III, engineers are already building a completely redesigned heat shield with improved performance. This maneuver was a one-time necessary bridge, a forced hand in the name of progress. But they did leave something behind. Something eternal. On the near side of the moon lies a crater the crew unofficially dubbed Carol. During certain lunar phases, when the sunlight hits at just the right angle, you can actually see it from Earth. It serves as a silent reminder that behind the cold calculations and the lethal risks, there is always a human story. And that sometimes, the longest journey home is the one taken to keep a promise.